I didn't think much of it when I mounted the dish. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the breeze smells like cut grass, and time seems to slow just enough to remind you you're still alive. I'd been meaning to install the satellite for months, not for watching cable news or old westerns, though it could do that too. No, I had something more practical in mind. As a former federal systems technician retired after 3 decades maintaining encrypted communications and remote relay networks, I knew better than to rely solely on one stream of information. Fiber optics are fast until they aren't. Storms knock them out. Construction crews sever lines, and don't even get me started on routine maintenance windows from our local ISP. That dish was my redundancy plan. Silent, efficient, mine. The installation took less than 2 hours. I used a discrete mounting bracket behind the chimney, ran a low-profile coaxial line through the attic, and grounded the unit properly to the panel by the back gate. I double-checked the signal lock clear stable even during partial cloud cover, and powered it down, content to leave it idle until needed. The next morning, there was a paper folded neatly in a red plastic sleeve stuffed in the corner of my front door. At first, I thought it was a newsletter, or maybe one of those reminders about trimming shrubs or holiday lighting restrictions. But as I opened it, the weight of bureaucracy hit me like a brick. Notice of violation. It was bolded in all caps at the top, followed by language so stiff it could have been written by a committee of lawyers with nothing better to do. Unapproved exterior fixture. Non-compliant with aesthetic standards. Potential obstruction of community visual cohesion, phrases I hadn't heard since my days decoding bloated defense procurement contracts. And then, the signature Karen M. Halbridge, HOA president. I'd met her once before, late 40s, tight blonde, bun-red lipstick like she was headed to court. Always carried a clipboard, always. She reminded me of the kind of officer who never saw combat, but loved reprimanding those who had. And apparently now, she thought she had jurisdiction over the air above my roofline. I stood there with the letter in hand, rereading the violation. It claimed I had 7 days to remove the unauthorized satellite apparatus or face an escalating series of fines, beginning at $100 per day. I'll admit I laughed at first, the absurdity of it. My house sits at the end of a cul-de-sac, partially shielded by a line of old oaks and pines. No one from the street could even see the dish unless they came onto my property, which I now suspected Karen had done. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of my yard. Sure enough, there were fresh boot prints in the pine mulch along the eastern fence line, leading right to a gap between the hedges where someone could have peered in. The HOA bylaws, as I recall, didn't permit trespass for surveillance purposes, but that was assuming Karen played by the rules. By Monday, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Someone had posted on the Nextdoor app about satellite radiation risks and unregulated transmissions interfering with emergency services. I knew exactly who'd started that nonsense. The following day, Karen appeared in front of my house. She didn't knock. Just stood there, arms folded, eyes scanning the front elevation like she was auditing it for sins. I opened the door and waited. "Mr. Hardin," she said, voice clipped, as if she'd been practicing her delivery. "This is your official notice. The satellite dish is in violation of Section 4, Article 9 of the Community Code. You are expected to comply." I met her gaze for a long beat. "I'm within my rights," I said calmly. FCC regulations supersede HOA guidelines when it comes to satellite receivers. That article predates the Telecommunications Act of 1996. She blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "Our community values visual consistency. That dish is an eyesore. An eyesore no one can see unless they're trespassing." Karen's nostrils flared. "We'll be following up." Then she turned and walked off, her heels clicking down my concrete path like gavel strikes. That night, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and pulled the HOA handbook out from the drawer where it had lived untouched since I bought the house 5 years ago. I read every word, every clause, every amendment. And I realized something: they'd never updated the technological standards. Everything written assumed this was still 1993. No mention of broadband, no rules about fiber relay boxes, nothing about backup communication arrays. It was all hedges, mailboxes, and approved exterior paints. That should have been the end of it. A reasonable HOA would have conceded or at least opened dialogue. But this was Karen, and Karen wasn't about reason. She was about control. 3 days later, I received a second notice. This one threatened legal action. It came with photos grainy zoomed in, clearly taken from behind the hedges on my property line. I looked at them carefully. Then I noticed the reflection of a red windbreaker in one of the windows. I wasn't just being monitored, I was being hunted. That night, I made a quiet decision. If Karen wanted to play games, fine. But she'd forgotten something crucial. Something I'd deliberately left buried under years of suburban silence. I built this neighborhood's internet. Not in some abstract, I contributed way. No, the actual infrastructure, the physical relays, the redundant nodes, the security protocols. Back when the development was being built, they hadn't yet contracted with a major ISP. The HOA had reached out to a guy who knew a guy, and I'd been that guy. I had volunteered to set it up as a side project during early retirement. They couldn't afford a full system, so I let them patch through a relay I'd installed on the back of my garage, with my private satellite uplink as failover. They'd never upgraded, never thanked me, never remembered. But I remembered everything, and now, thanks to Karen, I had every reason to remind them. By the time Friday rolled around, Karen had evolved from mildly annoying to fully obsessed. The HOA bulletin board by the mailboxes had a fresh, laminated poster titled Satellite Dishes and Visual Harmony, complete with a blurry image of my roofline that looked like it had been taken from across the street, possibly with a telephoto lens. The image was circled in red, with an arrow pointing to the satellite dish like it was a weapon cache. Neighbors started acting strange. The Hendersons, who used to wave when they walked their dog past my place, now averted their eyes. Mrs. Callahan from 2 doors down mentioned in passing that Karen had told her I was violating federal airwave laws. Someone even slid a pamphlet under my doormat about dangers of unregulated radio transmissions. I didn't know whether to laugh or light it on fire. Karen had made me the villain of the month, and she was just getting started. By Sunday, her crusade reached new levels of absurdity. She began doing slow drive-bys in her silver Lexus, holding her phone up as if recording every inch of my property. I caught her once, crouching by my side fence, pretending to tie her shoe while pointing her phone through the slats. I opened the gate just to say hello, and she practically fell backward into the street. "You can't harass me on my own property, Karen," I said, voice steady. "I'm simply enforcing the rules," she snapped, standing and brushing imaginary dirt off her pantsuit. "You brought this on yourself." "What exactly are you afraid of?" I asked. "That I might beam secret transmissions to Pluto." "You think you're clever, Mr. Harden," she said coldly. "But cleverness doesn't override community standards." That night, I checked my mailbox and found a new letter from the HOA, a formal warning about antagonizing board members. The complaint cited intimidating behavior and intentional confrontation. I almost choked on my laugh. The woman trespassed on my property and filmed my house, and I was the threat. The community's rules, if you could call them that, had become a tool of tyranny. No appeal process, no vote. Karen had turned a volunteer board into her personal fiefdom. At this point, I knew the dish wasn't the issue. It was a symbol, a challenge to her authority. And Karen, like any petty dictator, couldn't tolerate challenges. I started documenting everything. Time-stamped photos, voice memos of interactions, copies of the HOA handbook, local and federal telecommunication statutes. I even dug out the dusty binder with the original infrastructure plan I'd submitted to the HOA when I installed the internet relay, a plan they'd approved by unanimous vote back when they needed me, back before they forgot who built their foundation. Karen, however, was focused on winning her battle in the court of public opinion. A week later, she organized a special town walk her term, where HOA members would stroll through the neighborhood and observe any ongoing violations. I watched from my porch as a group of 7 residents followed her like a school tour, their faces uncertain. She led them directly to the front of my property. Here she declared loudly, pointing to my chimney. You'll see an unauthorized satellite device that creates disharmonic elevation variance in our uniform roofline. Disharmonic elevation variance. They all looked up confused. Some squinted, others mumbled. One man leaned over to his wife and whispered something that made her giggle. I could tell the spell was starting to crack, so Karen doubled down. This kind of selfish modification, she said, raising her voice, erodes our neighborhood's values. If we allow one resident to install unapproved tech, what's next? Neon signs, rooftop antennas, chicken coops in front yards. That's when I stood up and stepped off the porch. Would anyone like to see the paperwork approving the infrastructure that supports your internet, I said, holding up the binder. Or the contract authorizing my installation of the uplink system that keeps this community online. Silence. Karen's face went pale. That's not relevant here, she snapped. Isn't it? I said calmly. Because the uplink box that feeds your Zoom meetings and Netflix sits 20 feet behind that dish. You know, the one you called an eyesore. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. One woman actually raised her hand like we were in school. So, you built the internet back in 2014, I said. Before there was a permanent line. Before the HOA had a real budget. Before Karen was president. I didn't wait for her reaction. I went back inside and closed the door. That night, my doorbell rang. It was Mark Rowley, a younger neighbor I didn't know well, quiet guy, worked in cybersecurity. He held a six-pack of beer and a look of curiosity. Mind if I ask you a question? He said. We sat on my porch, the crickets singing background music to his questions. He'd read the HOA posts. He'd seen Karen's theatrics, but he wasn't buying it. When I showed him the plans, the diagrams, the email thread with the original HOA board thanking me for installing the relay, his jaw dropped. You're the reason we have that wicked fast backbone, he said. No wonder my ping's always so good. I didn't advertise it, I said. Didn't want to make it a thing. Well, he said, standing if she cuts you off, I'll help you get a petition signed. Honestly, I think people are starting to see what she really is. The next day, a third violation notice arrived. This time it came with a formal threat. If the dish is not removed within 48 hours, the HOA will initiate legal proceedings. It was stapled to my front gate. Karen had underlined the last line. In red ink, they'd drawn their line. But they forgot I built the terrain beneath it. I kept that last violation notice pinned to my refrigerator like a war trophy. 48 hours, it said. That was my final window to comply, or they'd escalate the matter to legal channels. The phrasing was vague, on purpose, designed to intimidate, not inform. That's the HOA's oldest trick, make people afraid of a lawsuit they can't afford, even when the law isn't on the HOA's side. But I've been around too long to be scared by empty threats on embossed letterhead. Still, I didn't take it lightly. I spent that first night going through my old files, revisiting the original HOA charter, and pulling out every federal regulation I could find about satellite communications. I emailed a friend from my days in the Department of Energy's Secure Networks Division, a policy analyst who now consults for telecom firms, and asked him to confirm what I already knew: my dish was protected under federal OTARD rules, and the HOA didn't have a legal leg to stand on. I even printed the regulation out. Highlighted the part that said local housing covenants couldn't ban or restrict devices used to receive video programming signals via satellite, as long as they were under 1 meter in diameter. Mine was 60 centimeters. And then I waited. The second day, the supposed final deadline came with no knock, no email, no call. But at exactly 5:37 p.m., Karen returned. I saw her through the blinds walking like she was on parade, inspection clipboard in hand, wearing her signature red HOA windbreaker like it was a military uniform. She walked straight to the foot of my driveway and raised her phone to take more pictures. This time, I opened the door before she could finish. Still out of compliance, she said, not even bothering to make eye contact. You're trespassing again, Karen. This is common ground, she shot back, as defined in the plat. And I'm within my rights to enforce community regulations. No, you're not, I said, stepping outside and holding up the highlighted printout. Federal code overrides your precious bylaws. OTR'd. Look it up. Or better yet, go ahead and file that lawsuit. Let's see how fast a judge throws it out. She took the paper without even glancing at it. "You think you're protected," she said coldly. "You're not. The board doesn't take kindly to residents who believe they're above the community." "I'm not above it," I said. "I just remember what it was built on. That landed." She flinched just slightly before turning away, walking back to her car with her back stiff as a fence post. She hadn't expected me to push back. Most people don't. I have a quiet exterior. Years working in classified environments taught me the value of silence. I don't raise my voice unless the roof is on fire, but when someone keeps poking a sleeping dog, eventually it bites. Still, a part of me hoped it would end there. That my pushback would be enough. That maybe she'd realize she was out of line and back off. But that's the thing about people like Karen, they double down. The next morning, I woke up to find a flyer taped to every mailbox on our block. Titled Community Security Alert, it warned residents of unauthorized signal transmitters that may interfere with emergency communications and GPS navigation. There were no names, of course, just a blurred photo of my chimney again this time, with a red caution triangle watermark over it. I tore mine down and walked the block, removing each one. But it didn't stop the whispers. I overheard them at the coffee stand inside the community clubhouse, at the park watching kids play. Even the grocery store cashier, a teenager named Brett, who barely knew how to bag lettuce, asked me if I really had a government dish up there. That afternoon, I attended the monthly HOA board meeting, the first one I'd gone to in over a year. They held it in the multi-purpose room behind the pool house with folding chairs, stale coffee, and the lingering scent of chlorine in the air. I counted 26 attendees, most of whom looked more curious than concerned. Karen sat at the center of the table like a monarch, flanked by two board members I didn't recognize. Her smile vanished the moment she saw me walk in. "We'll open the floor for comments after board business," she announced, tapping her pen on the microphone like she was hosting a press conference. I waited. They discussed landscaping costs, approved new pool furniture, debated the installation of more speed bumps, and then Karen said, "One final note, we've received multiple complaints regarding unauthorized equipment installed on private residences, which may endanger the community's communications infrastructure. We're currently consulting legal experts and will take appropriate action." I raised my hand. Karen ignored it. "Public comments are limited to 2 minutes," she said, looking past me like I wasn't there. So I stood up, and I spoke. "My name is Daniel Harden. I've lived on Ridgeview Circle for 5 years. I designed and built the original internet relay network for this neighborhood free of charge after the developer failed to deliver on high-speed access. The uplink that feeds the community router runs from my property, which the HOA approved in writing." People murmured. Karen tried to cut in. "I'm not done," I said calmly. "The satellite dish in question is within size and placement guidelines protected under federal law. The FCC's OTRD rules prohibit any HOA from restricting its installation, and I have documentation to prove it." More murmurs. A few neighbors pulled out phones and started Googling. Karen went red. "I suggest I continued that before this board spreads misinformation or implies legal action, they review the regulations they're attempting to enforce. Otherwise, I'll be forced to contact both the State Regulatory Board and the Office of Civil Rights to report discriminatory enforcement." That shut the room down. Karen slammed her folder shut and declared the meeting adjourned. She bolted from the table like she'd been burned. Afterward, a few neighbors came up to me, shook my hand, asked if I really wired the whole network. I nodded modestly and reminded them I'd done it because we all needed it, not for credit. One man even said he remembered when I ran the cables back when his house was still drywall and concrete. I walked home that night in the dark, breathing in the cool air and wondering if that was the end of it. If maybe, just maybe, I'd finally shut her down. But then I saw it. A fresh sign staked in my lawn. Under investigation for illegal installations, violation 3 of 3. And on the back, in bold red ink, next step, termination of services. She wasn't backing down, and neither was I. I stood in my yard, staring at that sign, the red ink bleeding slightly from the morning dew, like blood trailing down a warning. Termination of services. The words echoed in my ears longer than they should have. It was so dramatic, so petty, and yet it rattled something in me. Services. What services exactly? Was Karen planning to terminate trash pickup mail? Did she think she had the authority to call the city and have me cut off because I had the gall to question her kingdom? I bent down and pulled the sign from the grass. The stake snapped with a satisfying crack, and I tossed the whole thing in the bin next to my garage. That should have been the end of it. But I stood there a while longer, the bin lid open, my hands gripping the edges like I might tear it off its hinges. And then, without thinking, I walked around back. Behind my garage, nestled between an overgrown hydrangea bush and a small wooden utility shed, sat the quiet core of the neighborhood's digital nervous system, a weather-sealed relay box bolted to the concrete wall, marked only with a small white sticker that read, Backbone Node A, installed by Hardin, July 2014. The sticker was faded now. Most people wouldn't even notice it. But I hadn't touched that box in years, and still it worked like a charm, because I'd built it to last, using military-grade materials and encrypted control firmware that I personally configured. Karen and her cronies had no idea what they were playing with. Back in 2014, the developer of our subdivision had grossly oversold the neighborhood's capabilities. The marketing flyers boasted state-of-the-art fiber, but what we got was a throttled line running down the spine of the block installed by the lowest bidder and constantly overloaded. When the HOA formed, they begged for a fix. I'd just retired from government service and thought I'd lend a hand, so I wired the damn thing myself. I offered the use of my private uplink for redundancy, built a shared relay, ran land-grade cabling to 6 homes, then extended it street by street. When the board finally got a Comcast contract, they still piggybacked off my relay because the latency on their line was garbage during peak hours. It was supposed to be temporary. But here we were, a decade later, and I was still the only thing keeping their precious online lives running. I walked inside and powered up the secure laptop I hadn't touched since I stopped doing freelance network audits. I connected to the private admin panel I'd created years ago, a separate network, one they never knew existed because they never bothered to ask. And there it was, Node A live. Relay status stable. Uplink 1 active. Uplink 2 standby. 2 uplinks. One via standard cable, the other via the satellite they wanted me to rip down. My system wasn't just some backyard hack. It was layered, compartmentalized, redundantly architected. Even if they cut the cable line, the satellite would kick in and preserve the connection. I'd tested it during a thunderstorm back in 2016, when the transformer blew 2 blocks down. And they thought it was just a dish. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the status page. This network had supported the lives of over 50 households for years. I'd never asked for anything. No monthly fees, no recognition. I just didn't want to see people struggle with buffering screens during work calls or have their kids lose homework to disconnections. But now, Karen had declared war. I clicked over to the device logs. Sure enough, traffic was still flowing through my uplink. Even the HOA Clubhouse Wi-Fi router showed activity still bouncing off my relay before reaching the wider net. If I unplugged it, well, they'd find out exactly what I meant to this place. I didn't flip the switch yet. No, that would have been too easy. I needed to be sure. Needed to know that they were still dependent. So I walked down the street to speak with my neighbor Greg, a middle school teacher who ran virtual tutoring from home. Dan, he said, surprised to see me. Hey, did you hear anything about that weird HOA flyer? Which one? I asked dryly. He chuckled. Fair point. I actually wanted to ask your internet. Do you know which line you're running through? Not really, he said. I think it goes through the main network hub. There's something near the back of your property, right? You helped build it. I nodded. Best internet I've ever had, he said. Especially during storms. Everyone else goes down. I stay online. Exactly. Thanks, I said, patting his shoulder. Just curious. I did the same with 3 other houses over the next hour. 2 retired couples, 1 single mom working nights for a call center. All of them described similar experiences, rock-solid service, fewer outages than before, and never a word of thanks to whoever kept it all going. They didn't know I was the reason, because I never told them, because I didn't need to, until now. That night I opened my closet, and took out a lockbox I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a thick manila folder, contracts, receipts, signed approvals from the original HOA board. Even a letter of commendation from the county telecom liaison thanking me for voluntary contribution to residential infrastructure. I laid them all out on my kitchen table. Karen had pushed this into official territory, so I would treat it like official business. The next morning, I dropped a sealed envelope into the HOA's mailbox. It contained a single page, a cease and desist letter notifying them that any further harassment or tampering with my equipment would be met with legal counteraction, and a line at the bottom that read, "Be advised, termination of services may go both ways." Then I returned home, made myself coffee, and stared again at the admin panel, Node A, live. Relay status stable. I hovered the cursor over the toggle. Did I really want to do this? Yes, I did. Because this wasn't just about the dish anymore. It was about the principle. It happened on a Tuesday morning just after 6:00 a.m. I watched the sun creep over the treetops, while steam curled from my mug. My hand hovered over the keyboard. The screen displayed the status of the relay I'd maintained for over a decade, something I'd given freely to a neighborhood that no longer deserved it. The admin panel showed everything was running smoothly, too smoothly. I moved the cursor over the master uplink toggle. A single click would do it. The system would enter silent fallback mode and begin throttling down every subnode. Residents would still have power, but their internet would grind to a crawl. Video calls would freeze. Streaming services would stutter. Home security systems would try to reconnect and fail. And Karen would lose the one thing she couldn't live without control. I pressed the button. Uplink A disabled. Relay node. A standby mode activated. Fallback timeout 0005. The screen blinked. Then it went still. The entire system, the network backbone used by over 50 homes, dropped into hibernation exactly as designed. I leaned back and listened to the silence. It didn't take long. By 6:14 a.m., the first domino fell. A neighborhood father named Tyler sent a text to the HOA group chat about his failed VPN login. His job required remote access to a client database every morning at dawn. Without it, he was locked out. 6 minutes later, someone else chimed in. Anyone else losing internet? At 6:24, the clubhouse lights flickered just enough to reset the smart thermostat and security system, which were both cloud-linked. Then came the real fireworks. At 6:41, I saw Karen's silver Lexus barrel down the street. She parked diagonally in front of my driveway and jumped out with her phone already glued to her ear. Her expression was tight eyes wild. She paced back and forth, gesturing at the screen like it owed her an apology. I stayed inside and watched from the front window, sipping coffee. At 6:52, she marched to the side of my house. I knew where she was going, the old shed, the one she'd never had access to. She rattled the door, then circled around the garage and tried to peer over the fence. Her voice carried through the morning stillness. "Dan," she shouted. "I know you're in there," I didn't answer. 2 minutes later, she was back in her car, driving up the street to another board member's house. By 7:15, the group chat was blowing up. Teachers couldn't access lesson plans. Work-from-home professionals couldn't log into servers. One neighbor wrote, "This is the third time this week. We need a better provider." Another added, "Didn't Dan set all this up?" Karen replied, "He is interfering with community infrastructure. This is being handled right." By 7:40, I received an email from Ridgeview Pines HOA legal liaison. The address was a Gmail account. The message was 3 sentences long, poorly formatted, and ended with, "This is your final warning to cease and desist network manipulation, or we will pursue civil action." I laughed out loud. I replied with a PDF attachment, a scanned copy of the 2014 HOA contract signed by the original president, acknowledging my role as volunteer systems architect with full rights to disable or withdraw service at owner's discretion. No response. But the panic had only just begun. By 8:00, several neighbors were gathered around the community bulletin board arguing loudly. I heard phrases like, "contract breach, who's responsible for this?" and, my favorite, "call the county." The county. What were they going to say? Yes. Mrs. Halbridge, we'll send someone to fix the free network you've been abusing for a decade. At 8:12, Mark Rowley. The cybersecurity guy rang my doorbell. I opened it to find him holding 2 cups of coffee and an expression that mixed admiration with disbelief. "Did you do it?" he asked. "Do what?" He smirked. "They're imploding. You've basically shut down Ridgeview." "Not Ridgeview," I said. "Just the freeloaders." He handed me a cup. "Karen's melting down. I overheard her saying she's going to take legal control of the system. Like she knows what that means." I nodded, sipping. "You okay with this?" he asked after a pause. "I mean, this isn't small." "I gave them 10 years," I said. "I donated time, money, bandwidth. I asked for nothing. The moment I asked for space on my own roof, they declared war. Karen thought she could weaponize ignorance. I just turned the mirror." Mark leaned on the railing. "You want backup? I can run a scan of the network logs and write a public report. Show people how much traffic still ran through your system even last week." "That'd help," I said. But I think the fallout's already begun. And I was right. By noon, a petition started circulating remove Karen Halbridge as HOA president. 15 signatures in 2 hours. By evening, it had over 50. But Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. At 5:37 p.m., a uniformed code enforcement officer from the city arrived at my door. He was polite, introduced himself as Officer Delgado, said someone had filed a complaint alleging I was operating a private telecom network without proper permits. I smiled. "Come on in," I said. "I've got documentation going back a decade, including your department's thank you letter for community service." To his credit, Officer Delgado was professional. He reviewed the documents, asked smart questions, then stood up and shook my hand. "You're good," he said. "Looks like you've been doing their job for free." "Still am," I said, nodding toward the blinking router. "Mind if I say something off the record?" "Please," he lowered his voice. "I've dealt with her before. Half her complaints are baseless. You're not the first guy she's tried to steamroll, but you are the first who actually fought back and won." "Not done yet," I said. "But I'm getting there." He smiled and walked off. That night, the entire neighborhood went offline officially. No backups, no failover, nothing. Karen tried to get an emergency ISP installation scheduled, but the soonest appointment was 4 days out. Everyone who worked from home screwed. Every kid with online homework panicked. Even the HOA's own email server hosted on a shared residential connection was down. And all because Karen couldn't tolerate a dish. I stood at my window sipping whiskey this time and watched the street go dark. No blinking porch cameras, no smart bulbs glowing blue, just silence and shadow. For the first time in years, it felt peaceful. I woke up the next morning to a strange quiet, not just the usual stillness of dawn, but a kind of communal hush, like the air itself had been turned down. Normally, I'd hear the whir of lawn sprinklers clicking on across the block, the occasional hum of a Tesla backing out of a driveway, distant music from someone's Bluetooth speaker warming up a workout routine. But today, nothing. It was like Ridgeview Circle had been muted. I stepped out onto my porch with my usual cup of coffee and scanned the street. 3 houses across the road had their garages open, but nobody was leaving. A few neighbors were standing on their driveways, phones in hand, frowning as they tapped at screens that no longer responded. I recognized the signs. They were checking their routers, resetting modems, staring at blinking lights with the same confusion I used to see in junior analysts when a system crashed 5 minutes before a live simulation. Karen's house, the Colonial at the Bend, was fully lit up. Curtains open, kitchen lights blazing. She was pacing in her kitchen in a bright red bathrobe, gesturing wildly to someone on speakerphone. She looked furious. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. By 9:00 a.m., I'd already received 5 knocks at my door. The first was a frazzled mom named Natalie, whose kids couldn't attend their online school sessions. Then came Tom, who worked in IT for a pharmaceutical company and couldn't log into his work VPN. "I'm not sure what's going on," I told each of them, calm as a priest. "But if it's related to the HOA, I'm not your guy anymore. You should ask Karen." That line worked wonders. Each face transformed with realization. A couple even cursed under their breath. At 9:46 a.m., the HOA sent out an urgent community update via paper flyer slipped into mailboxes, clearly printed in haste at someone's home office. The Ridgeview HOA is aware of a temporary interruption in internet services affecting several homes. We are actively coordinating with providers to restore access and apologize for the inconvenience. In the meantime, we ask all residents to remain patient and respectful. There was no mention of me, no mention of Karen, just a sterile note signed Ridgeview Pines HOA Executive Board. I knew exactly what that meant. Karen was scrambling. Around noon, I ventured to the clubhouse, a beige structure near the neighborhood entrance that served as our community center, complete with a conference room, a small gym, and what they called a business lounge. That lounge was where Karen had often held impromptu HOA meetings, tapping on her laptop in full view of residents to show she was always available. Today, the place was chaos. The doors were wide open, and inside were at least 20 people, mostly residents I only half recognized. They were gathered around the central table, arguing, not yelling, just tense, tight voices. Laptops were open, all showing the same thing, no connection. Phones out, some with tethering hotspots failing. One guy dug from the north end of the block was red in the face. "I've got a deadline," he barked. "My client's in Germany, and I can't even access my damn files." Why wasn't there a backup plan? Someone else asked. A woman in a green blouse said, "Wasn't Dan the one who ran the backup?" Karen sat alone at the far end, shoulders stiff, eyes locked on her laptop like she was trying to will it back to life. Her lipstick was smudged. Her bun was falling apart. She looked like a queen at the fall of her empire. And then Mark Rowley walked in with a stack of papers. He saw me and gave a small nod before turning to the group. "I did some digging," he said, voice loud and clear. "This is the system overview for Ridgeview's internet. According to these documents, the backbone network was constructed and maintained by Dan Harden with full authorization from the HOA dating back to 2014. Karen flinched. Mark kept going. "These papers show that the HOA relied on Dan's private uplink and hardware for core connectivity, and that the system was only ever maintained by him. Which means that if it's down now, it's because someone pushed too far." The room fell into a stunned silence. Then the questions came fast, sharp, urgent. "Is this true? Why didn't we know? Who approved this? Karen, did you revoke his access?" Karen stood. Her voice was thin but loud enough to carry. "He installed unauthorized satellite equipment. He violated community policy. It was a threat to visual consistency." "Visual consistency," a woman interrupted. "We don't have internet. My doorbell doesn't work." Karen tried to regain control. "This is a complex issue. There are legal implications. You tried to kick out the guy who gave us internet," said a tall man near the window. "And now you're surprised he unplugged the modem." I could see it all falling apart for her. Then came the death blow. A soft-spoken retiree named Susan, the type who always brought cookies to meetings and never said a bad word about anyone, stood up and looked at Karen dead on. "I think it's time we held a vote," she said, "to remove the current HOA president. You could have heard a pin drop." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at me for the first time. Really looked. And I saw something crack behind her eyes. Not rage, not indignation, fear. Because deep down, she finally realized what she'd done. By 3:00 p.m., the vote was underway. It wasn't official yet, but people were texting, emailing, knocking on doors. The motion to remove her was circulating like wildfire. And me, I was back home, restoring the uplink, not all the way, just enough. I brought Node A back online, limited capacity. Enough for basic services, security systems, telemedicine access. But streaming, gaming, and cloud syncing still frozen. Let them feel the fragility. Let them remember what it's like to depend on something they can't control. Relay Node A active. 40% bandwidth capacity. Fallback uplink partial mode enabled. I leaned back and let the admin panel fade into the background. That evening, I walked out to the curb and waved to the Hendersons, who waved back. They hadn't looked me in the eye in 2 weeks. Small victories. Karen didn't come out of her house, but the vote tally did. 71 votes for removal, 8 against. And just like that, Ridgeview Pines had no HOA president. The clipboard was finally down. The day after Karen was ousted, Ridgeview felt different. It wasn't just the slower traffic or the way neighbors actually looked each other in the eyes again. It was in the quiet ripple of conversations. Hesitant, curious, sometimes even apologetic. I'd lived here for over 5 years, and yet it was the first time people asked about me. Not the dish, not the internet, not the drama, just me. That morning, I found a handwritten note slipped under my door. No name. Just thank you for standing up to her. We were scared to speak. We won't be anymore. Below it was a short list of residents who had shared the same fear. 7 names. All of them had in some way felt Karen's control, whether through fines, invasive inspections, or the constant threat of board review. I made coffee, sat with that list, and thought about what I'd been holding on to for years. The full history of this neighborhood's network wasn't just about wires and routers. It was a story of neglect, not by chance, but by choice. So I decided to tell the whole story. That afternoon, I wrote a public letter. I printed it 1 copy for every household. I walked the streets myself, slipping it into mailboxes, taping it gently to doors, placing it under doormats if no slot was available. People saw me. They didn't turn away. Some waved. Some said thanks. One man teared up. The letter read, "To my neighbors of Ridgeview Pines. You may know me as the guy with the satellite dish, the one who shut down the network, the one who made Karen mad. But there's more to it. Back in 2014, when this neighborhood was still being developed, the promise of high-speed internet was a lie. The infrastructure wasn't ready. The providers weren't available. The HOA at the time approached me because I'd worked in federal systems for over 30 years and had the tools and know-how to build a relay network. I agreed not because I wanted power, but because I wanted community. I installed the nodes, the switches, the uplinks at my own expense. No one paid me. No one asked me to. I just did it. And for nearly a decade, you've all used that system. Through storms, through outages, through a pandemic. I maintained it because I believed in shared support, quiet contribution. But Karen changed things. She turned collaboration into control. She weaponized the rules. She tried to erase me and worse my work because it didn't fit her aesthetic. I didn't unplug the neighborhood out of spite. I did it to remind us all that when we allow fear and arrogance to go unchecked, we lose more than signal. We lose connection. You're back online now, not fully, but enough. I'll restore everything soon. But before I do, I needed you to know the truth. Not about me, about what we allow and what we're willing to stand up for. Thank you to those who stood with me, and thank you to those who now see more clearly. Dan Harden, Ridgeview Circle Lot 12. I figured maybe a few people would read it. Maybe I'd get a couple of nods at the mailbox. That was enough for me. But I underestimated the hunger for honesty. Within 2 days, the letter had been shared across the entire Ridgeview community portal. Someone scanned it, turned it into a post titled, "Our Neighborhood's Unsung Engineer." Comments poured in. I had no idea. I thought the cable came from Comcast. I'm ashamed I never said thank you. Dan, if you ever run for HOA board, you've got my vote. Of course, I had no intention of running. But something was changing. Not just in how people saw me, but in how they saw each other. Conversations started happening. Real ones. Not just about paint colors or lawn heights, but about shared values. About transparency. About how to build something better now that the clipboard was gone. Then came the HOA board's emergency meeting, the first without Karen. It was held outside under the shade of the oaks near the park as a symbolic shift from the sterile rooms where Karen used to rule. Dozens attended. Some brought folding chairs. Others stood quietly in the back. They asked me to speak. I didn't want to. I'm not a speech guy. I spent decades behind secure doors where talking too much got you fired or worse. But I saw the looks in their eyes, not demanding, but hopeful. So I stood. I didn't talk about satellites or routers or regulations. I talked about memory. I told them how easy it is to forget where the signal comes from when everything works. How easy it is to take for granted the invisible hands that keep our lives stable. And how dangerous it is to let that comfort make us complacent. We can't afford to forget the people who hold us up, I said. And we can't allow any system, HOA government, or otherwise, to silence those who make that stability possible. They clapped, not loudly, but sincerely. The new interim board asked if I'd consider leading a committee to redesign the tech infrastructure, not just internet, but communications access controls, even emergency systems. I agreed on one condition. No more secrets, no more gatekeeping. We do it together or not at all. They agreed. That night, I powered up Node A to 100% again. The streets came alive, porch lights blinking back on Ring cameras, syncing TVs resuming where they'd paused midstream. It wasn't victory, not exactly. It was restoration. But more importantly, recognition. And for a man who'd spent most of his life staying off the radar, it felt strange and good. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. It was a full week after the vote when Karen reemerged thinner and paler than usual, without her clipboard, without the HOA windbreaker, without the control that once made her magnetic to the fearful. She didn't walk the street like she used to, chin high, surveying everyone else's lawn, like a queen inspecting her borders. No. That morning she moved differently. Small, tired, human. I was raking leaves in the front yard when I saw her approaching slowly, almost reluctantly. Her lips were tight, her hands folded in front of her like a child entering a principal's office. I almost didn't recognize her, but the moment our eyes met, I knew. I didn't say a word. "Mr. Hardin," she began, voice soft, uncertain. "Dan is fine," I said without looking up. She hesitated. "Dan. I came to talk." I nodded once, but said nothing. She shifted her weight. I could feel her fighting for words, maybe even the right tone. But Karen, the Karen I'd known, had always relied on structure, policy, procedure. She had no playbook for humility. "I didn't realize how much of the system you built," she said finally. "No one told me." I leaned on the rake handle. "You never asked," she winced. "That's fair." For a moment, we just stood there, the wind rustling through the last few leaves clinging to the maple above us. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said. "I thought I was protecting the community. By accusing me of breaking federal law, I asked, not unkindly." Her face flushed. "I got carried away. I didn't understand what I was looking at." "You didn't want to understand," I corrected. "You saw something you couldn't control and decided it didn't belong." Karen looked down. "You're right. That stopped me." She said it quietly, but clearly. "You're right," she repeated. "About all of it." I lost perspective. I let the silence stretch, long enough for it to feel uncomfortable. Then I asked, "Why are you really here?" She looked up at me then, and her eyes weren't sharp or calculating anymore. They were exhausted. "I need to apologize." I waited. "Not just for the notices or the fines or the way I treated you," she said, "but for turning a place that was supposed to feel safe into something rigid, performative." It wasn't just you I hurt. That was true. I'd learned more in the last week than I had in 5 years of HOA newsletters and mailers. People had been fined for garden gnomes, threatened over wreaths on doors, told their porch chairs were non-compliant. One woman had paid nearly $500 in fees for a flower bed that clashed with the community aesthetic. Karen had made an art of policing the ordinary, and now with nothing left to wield, she looked hollow. "I'm stepping away," she said. "Not just from the board, from the neighborhood. I listed the house this morning." I blinked. "That I didn't expect. My husband's been wanting to move closer to his brother," she added. "I think it's time." I nodded slowly. "I know I'm the villain in your story," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "You made yourself the villain. But that doesn't mean you have to stay one." Karen looked startled, like that idea had never occurred to her. "You want forgiveness?" I asked. "It's not mine to give. Talk to the people you actually hurt." She swallowed. "They won't listen. Try anyway." She nodded, eyes glassy. "Thank you, Dan." I didn't say anything. Just watched her walk back toward her car, the same one she'd once driven like a patrol cruiser, and for the first time, she looked small next to it. That afternoon, she went door to door with envelopes. Not flyers, not warnings, letters. I don't know what they said. Maybe apologies. Maybe explanations. But I heard later that she cried on more than one porch. A week later, a moving truck pulled up. She was gone by sunset, and Ridgeview Pines breathed easier. But her departure wasn't the end of the story. Not really. In the absence of Karen, something rare happened. People started organizing for the right reasons. The interim board met twice a week in public at the park, not behind closed doors. Budgets were shared transparently. Residents were asked for input on landscaping community events, even mailbox design. And me, I was asked to give a presentation, not on what went wrong, on what made it work. So I did. One Friday evening, under string lights near the tennis courts, I rolled out diagrams on a folding table and explained in plain English how the network functioned, how it had been built, how it could evolve. Teenagers asked questions. Seniors nodded slowly, taking notes. One mom offered to donate funds to upgrade the relay housing. Another man said he'd volunteer to run cables if needed. It was the first time the community felt like a community. And when the last question had been asked, I ended with this neighborhood runs better when we trust the people behind the curtain, not fear them. When we listen instead of issuing warnings, when we offer help instead of demanding obedience. They applauded, not for me, for the message. Later that night, as I walked home, Mark caught up to me. "You think she meant it?" he asked. "Karen," I said. He nodded. "I think she finally realized she wasn't the hero of the story," I said. "That's something." Mark paused. "You think you'll miss the drama?" I laughed softly. "Not even a little." And I meant it, because for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next notice, the next inspection, the next fight. I was just home. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. Little by little, Ridgeview Pines began to look less like a curated catalog of suburban control and more like a real neighborhood. One with quirks, with personality, with people who waved again and meant it. It started small. The Ramirez family put wind chimes back on their porch. For 2 years, Karen had fined them every time they did citing noise pollution. Now the chimes danced freely in the breeze, their sound light and joyful. Mrs. Callahan, the widow 3 houses down, finally rehung her late husband's Navy flag. It had been removed after the HOA claimed flags must be approved and properly mounted. I helped her install it myself this time. She cried when it caught the wind. The funny thing is, none of these acts were rebellious. They were simply normal. But under Karen's rule, normal had become criminal. Order had become fear. Compliance, a currency. Now people were living again. As for me, the changes came quietly, respectfully. No one threw a parade. No one made a speech in my honor. Thank God. But they came by one, sometimes with a pie, sometimes with a thank you, sometimes just with an apology. The Hendersons brought a pot of chili and stayed for a chat. Said they were sorry for the way they'd kept their distance during the whole satellite mess. I told them it was water under the bridge. They stayed until dark. Natalie, the mom with the 2 boys who missed their online school, asked if I could help set up a better mesh system at their house. I said yes. She offered to pay. I said no. Even Tom, the IT guy, who had once rolled his eyes at me for still using cokes, showed up with a 6-pack and genuine humility. "You were right," he said simply. Mark offered to co-lead the new tech committee with me. He had ideas, energy vision, and the kind of enthusiasm I hadn't seen in this place since the foundation was poured. We started holding monthly open sessions at the park, showing neighbors how their networks worked, how to keep things secure, how to avoid getting scammed. The attendance grew with every session. Teens showed up, seniors took notes, parents brought coffee. People started trusting each other again. At one of those sessions, a little girl, maybe 10, raised her hand and asked, "So if the internet breaks again, are you going to fix it, Mr. Dan?" I smiled. "Only if you promise not to tell your teacher I helped you skip homework." She giggled and nodded solemnly. Word got around. One day, I was walking past the old clubhouse when I saw someone had replaced the glass case where Karen used to post her bulletins. Instead of bylaws and violation warnings, there was a new corkboard filled with photos, community BBQs, pet adoption flyers, birthday party invitations. At the bottom, someone had tacked up a copy of my open letter, laminated, underlined. "Community isn't control," someone had scrawled beneath it in marker, "it's connection." It stopped me in my tracks. I didn't write that line. But someone read the spirit of everything I tried to do and turned it into something lasting. Later that week, the interim board approached me. They wanted to make the temporary leadership permanent and were putting together nominations for the upcoming election. They asked if I'd accept a nomination for board president. I laughed, loudly. No chance, I said. But I'll help you build the foundation. They didn't argue, they just thanked me. That night, I sat on my porch as the sun dropped low behind the rooftop. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. Not the kind of breath you take between battles, but the kind that comes when the war is over. I looked out across Ridgeview Circle. The porch lights twinkled like stars. Someone was playing music softly down the block. Dogs barked, kids laughed. And no one, not a single person, cared about the dish on my roof. It was still there, still operational, quietly feeding a redundant uplink into a system that now had full community oversight. I hadn't removed it. No one had asked me to, because now they understood. I wasn't the threat. I'd been the safety net all along. Karen had seen control as power, but real power, real leadership. It's the kind that steps back once the system can stand on its own. And as I sat there, a breeze passing over the yard, I'd finally let grow a little wild again. I realized something important. I wasn't just respected. I was trusted. Not because I demanded it, because I earned it. Not with orders, but with quiet, steady work. The kind no one notices until it disappears. The sun had just crested over the rooftops when I took the last step in my quiet revolution. I climbed up onto the roof, not to remove the satellite dish that ship had long sailed. No, this time I was up there for something far more personal. With a wrench in my pocket and a small steel bracket in hand, I adjusted the angle of the dish ever so slightly, optimizing it, not for community service or signal share, but for me. My signal, my system, my choice. As I tightened the last bolt and wiped sweat from my forehead, I looked out across Ridgeview Pines, my neighborhood, no longer my battlefield. The cul-de-sac was stirring to life. Sprinklers spun like clockwork. Someone was already jogging. And over at Lot 23, the Ramirez kids were chalking on their driveway again, filling it with rockets and stars, and a quote that made me stop cold. The sky is not the limit. That, I thought, is how it should feel to live somewhere, free. Later that morning, I sat on my porch with my second cup of coffee and a warm October sun washing over the railings. It was Saturday, and the street was alive in that old familiar rhythm, a mix of lawnmowers' laughter and the low hum of neighborly life that had once felt scripted and staged. Now it was something different, something real. Across the street, Mark was showing a couple of teens how to build a secure home server. They had a little folding table out wires everywhere. It reminded me of my first job way back before clearance badges and gray offices with no windows. A few minutes later, Mrs. Callahan waved to me as she planted daffodils along her walk, no more fearing flowerbed citations. And next door, Tom was finally hanging the porch swing he'd mentioned for years but never installed because Karen had told him it disrupted symmetry. I didn't even realize I was smiling. The strange part was how simple it all felt. After months of tension of notes, warnings, stares, and that creeping sense of being watched, the absence of pressure felt like a physical relief. Like taking off body armor you didn't even know you were wearing. And then something happened that would have stunned me months ago. Natalie's youngest, Miles, the shy one with the curly hair and oversized glasses, walked over holding a little box. "My mom said you like old radios," he said, opening it to reveal a handmade AM transmitter crafted from a kit. I laughed. "I do." "Can you teach me how to use it?" I looked down at him. His eyes sparkled the way only a kid's can when they've made something with their own hands and want you to see it. "Yeah," I said. "Let's tune in together." We sat at the picnic table behind my garage, surrounded by the chirp of finches and the faint static of his transmitter flickering to life. We played with frequencies sent out Morse code across a 5-house radius, and I watched his face light up like he'd discovered his own satellite. That was what it had always been about. Not bandwidth, not property lines, not the HOA's war on shrubs and signal dishes. It was about connection. Later that day, the new HOA board sent out their first official newsletter, plain paper, no red ink, no veiled threats, or authoritarian flair. At the top, in bold letters, a new chapter from rules to relationships. There was a quote under it, one I'd never shared publicly, but somehow they'd found it. Probably Mark. You can't code community into existence. You build it one conversation, one kindness, one signal at a time. DH. I shook my head, smiling. That line came from an old notebook I'd kept during my time in the service, a note to myself after a particularly hard day. I never imagined it would end up printed on paper beside barbecue schedules and welcome messages for new families. The letter continued. Thanks to the resilience and generosity of residents like Dan Hardin, Ridgeview Pines has rediscovered not just its infrastructure, but its spirit. We look forward to building a future grounded in collaboration, transparency, and trust. And yes, the internet is back. There was even a PS. The board voted unanimously to approve Dan's satellite dish retroactively and permanently. I laughed so hard, I nearly spilled my coffee. But the truth is, I didn't need the approval anymore. Because in every way that mattered, I was already free. Free from HOA tyranny. Free from fear of retaliation. Free from the quiet burden of carrying everything in silence. That night I walked the street under a full moon. Porch lights twinkled like constellations. The sound of someone strumming a guitar drifted down from a second-story balcony. I passed the old clubhouse now left unlocked, not out of negligence, but trust. As I turned the final corner toward my house, I paused. The dish was visible from this angle, just slightly a small metal curve catching the moonlight. Not a scar, not a rebellion, a symbol of resilience, of boundaries reclaimed, of what happens when quiet men finally say, enough. I stood for a long while, hands in my pockets, the wind cool on my face. The war was over, and I had won not with rage or lawsuits or noise, but with truth, with stillness, with the undeniable power of someone who knows exactly what he's built and refuses to let anyone take it from him again. This was my home. Not because I signed a deed, but because I earned it. Every inch, every wire, every connection. I turned, walked up the steps, and closed the door behind me. And for the first time in a long time, I slept.